Welcome to the Arsenic Theory channel. Today I wanted to discuss with you two books that I have read recently. One of them I read a long time ago when actually it came out. So this one is by Jacques Attali or Attali. He was right here, as you can see. It's called A Brief History of the Future. This title frankly intrigued me very much. That's why I picked up this book. It basically talks about, forecasting what the world will look like, politically speaking, economically speaking, by the year 2050. So this guy, Jacques Attali, let me show you his picture, his pretty face right here, as you probably can see. Yep. So he was, among being the first president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He also advised, French President François Mitterrand. And, he's very influential, person in France, in Europe, and, including America. So it's a very interesting book, very intriguing. It talks about a whole lot of things. It talks about artificial intelligence, talks about, human nature. Another thing that, I really liked about it, it goes through what he calls a movement of capital. And he basically gives a very brief history of what globalization is and how it began. So apparently it originated, in the Middle East, and it traveled over the Mediterranean Sea all the way to Europe and like Vienna, other cities, then went across La Manche into London, and then traveled across Atlantic to Boston, and then from Boston traveled to California, where it is currently at. And so what he says is that this globalization, and they moved basically through Europe, from Middle East, through Europe, all the way to the United States, and that's where we have it now. That's why, the financial sector, where everything is controlled is in the US and, London. Oh, he also talks about world government. Yeah. He almost sees it as being inevitable in, with the trends that he sees, in the world. He says that looking at the past history, all the way to the times of even like Napoleon and, Hitler, he says that, people of this character, of this dimension that have, reshaped the entire, societies and political fabric, even they have not been able to stop the kind of overarching trend in this world. And what it seems like this trend is towards like some sort of world order where there is a consortium of world governments that are kind of, deciding things on a planetary scale. They're not necessarily going to be working, perfectly with each other. He says that it might be a polycentric world that we will see by the year 2050, where a bunch of different political conglomerates will be talking to each other and deciding the fate of the world, so to speak. So Jacques Attali claims that the US power will wane over time and give way to other countries to enter kind of the global scene and take over the reins after the United States. I'm not sure I agree with him on that point, but certainly, there is, developing world that is coming up right now in this into this world affairs, into the the order of things, and they are influencing the decisions on a worldwide scale. So there are three dimensions to how the way the world works and what actually makes decisions. One of them is religious, which is kind of ritual order, which gives you kind of more of a traditional way of looking at things. There is a military, imperial order, which makes decisions based on a military might, and mercantile, which is, an economic order, something that we currently live in today, where, military and, religious institutions do not really make decisions and do not influence as much as mercantilists, the economists do. So economics rules the world at this point, not religious order, not military. Just to give you a quick example, let's say during Cold War, military and your armaments played a much greater role than economics did. He even goes so far as to say that eventually this world government that will appear by the year 2050 will create a constitution for the planet that will pick up and extend the current United Nations Charter. So, those that follow politics kind of know that, United Nations have been going through a sort of crisis of trying to find what their places in the current world order is, because they kind of becoming irrelevant as different centers of power appear in the world, and countries do not really get along with each other. So he's saying that constitution for the planet will be drafted that will kind of create this checks and balances and rules for the entire planet. Furthermore, quasi-currency will be created where all central banks will coordinate this creation of either a basket of currencies or some kind of global quasi-currency. I can actually envision that happening with, let's say, a credit system, where instead of being issued cash money or a check or direct deposit or whatever have you, you'll be given credits, and you'll be able to use those credits across the world. And perhaps maybe if you are a government employee, you will have expiring credits. Let's say you're given 5,000 credits a month and you use it or lose it, kind of thing. I can see a sort of system like that, appearing by the year 2050. It will be akin to the Total Recall scenario. I'm sure you guys, have seen that movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he's on Mars. And, I'm not going to obviously, belabor you with the story, but in any case, there is a system of credits there. You remember when he walks into the office, to basically schedule his, trip, mind trip to Mars, where he actually not physically going to go there, but he will be implanted this memory. They are talking about, hey, this will cost you this number of credits. And obviously other kind of dystopian scenarios, look at that, incorporate that particular, aspect into their scenarios as well. So here is his vision for the years 2025 to 2035, just to summarize it. The mercantile order, don't forget that's an economic order, economics rule the world, right? So the mercantile order will organize itself as a juxtaposition of market democracies. The world will be polycentric. Polycentric, that means, there'll be many centers of political influence around the world. So, for example, bipolar world, right? During Cold War, where you had the United States and the Soviet Union, two centers of the world, and everybody else was gravitating toward either one of the centers. When you're talking about polycentric world, what it means is there'll be conglomerate of different nations all over the world, which will be, acting in consortium to, make, decisions. Quick example, let's say North American Union, let's say European Union, let's say African Union, let's say some kind of Asian Union, and let's say Russia, right? All these different parts of the world represent kind of their own polite center. Okay, so that's what he means by polycentric. All right, so let me go again. The world will be polycentric, with one or two major powers on each continent: the United States, Brazil, Russia, and the European Union, even if the last named will not offer all the attributes of a state, right? So I'm not sure how true that is, this idea that the world will be more polycentric, because I think it's almost wishful thinking. I think European nations actually want the world to be polycentric, but I don't think it actually what it will become. It might not be, but I think that's what their desired state of the world affairs is. That's what they want. And the reason for that is because currently, United States makes all the decisions for them. It it gives them that security umbrella under which many nations kind of go under and do their own thing after that. But in any case, many nations, I don't think they like that United States makes their decisions for them, that they kind of infringe on their sovereignty and tell them what to do. So in any case, I mean, it's a great book to read. If you want to kind of figure out what the world might look like by the year 2050. I have read many books by Jacques Attali. One of them is called, Winners and Losers in a Coming World Order. I have read, a book on Labyrinth because, he also, examines the book on like music, art, literature, etc. But I think this is one of the most provocative books, that he has written. Henry Kissinger even endorses it. He says, it's a brilliant and provocative. His conclusions will be as controversial as they are difficult to dismiss. I mean, one other thing that I really liked him going into is the history of globalization. He traces the globalization all the way back to the Crusaders. Crusaders, as some of you may know, issued kind of the first checks and were the first bankers, in the world. And this kind of all started this mercantile order and the globalization aspect of it, where they were spreading certain ideology, certain order of things in a system where they traveled. And that's what, US is currently doing, right? It spreads its tentacles all over the place, plants the ideas of democracy, open society, free trade, democracy, I already said that, free market, things of that nature. He goes country by country. He goes, stage by stage to try to trace back that history of globalization, as it traveled across empires, across cities, across, nations, and where it ended up today, which is, the United States, or more specifically California, which became the hub of innovation, of economic development, and of financial strength. California is still in the top 10 economies of the entire world. Just one little state is in the top 10 economies of the entire world. The so-called nomadic ubiquity. He says for the first time in a long time, maybe even in 3, 4, maybe even more, 10,000 of years, human beings are becoming monomadic, and they will be monomadic, especially the higher class, people from the higher class in the developed world, that is, the United States and Europe. They will be traveling more. They will no longer be rooted in one particular city or a country. They'll be more international people. They will be traveling across all over the world, and live in many countries throughout the year, conducting their business. So he calls it kind of the reappearance of the nomadism. And obviously, the spread of telecommunication technologies and communication in general, the Internet of Things, helps people be on the go and to kind of return to this nomadism from which we exited. As you guys know, we started kind of being sedentary during the agricultural revolution, where we actually can settle down in one place for a long period of time because we were able to grow crops and herd animals and stay there for a long time, build families, etc., build tribes, build villages. However, now with the advent of free trade, this economic or mercantile order and rapid communications have enabled us to become nomads once more. And that's what he says kind of the upper class will start doing, being nomadic. So I highly recommend this book. It's called A Brief History of the Future by Jacques Attali. Attali, as you can see, endorsed by Henry Kissinger, and it's a great book. You must read. The second book is called 2052, a global forecast for the next 40 years. Kind of similar, dates. Also examines the world up to the year 2050, right? By Jorgen Randers. And he is the one that, helped draft the book called The Limits to Growth. As you probably know from the research you have done or you will be doing as a result of this video, is that, Limits to Growth kind of warned, the West that if, consumption will continue, if population will continue to grow at this rate, there'll be unbalance between the amount of food available for humans and the population, and thus there'll be, a Malthusian scenario where people will be starving on the streets and there'll be not enough food for to sustain this overpopulation issue, right? So he looks into this kind of issues here. I don't really particularly like this book, to be honest with you. I have read the entire book. It's it has a lot of different vignettes written by other scientists, so it's more of a collaborative work here. He looks into the consumption of energy in contrast in relation to the population growth. One interesting, and the reason I don't like this book is because, first of all, every single recipe that he gives to overcome these issues of overpopulation, energy, the lack of energy resources, the lack of resources in general, is some kind of big government coming in and making things run better and smoother. I don't think that happens, and he admits that governments by their nature cannot run things efficiently. It has to be private effort. However, he says, if you want to curtail global warming and kind of prevent planet to descending into this chaotic state of climate change, etc., what we need to have is a stronger arm and a more decisive voice that will change our behavior, the way we do things now, such as burning fossil fuels without any limits, etc. He says that the private efforts will not cure the planet. One aspect, though, that I found very intriguing and interesting in this book is when he talks about the population peak and overpopulation in general. He says by the year 2040, 2035, 40, 45 or so, in that kind of range, the population will peak at 12 billion people, I believe, and it will have a drastic decline. And the reason for that is, first of all, there are kind of two trends. The so-called aging or graying of the world population, where, there are more people coming of age, nearing retirement, than there are people born. So there are more kind of elderly people, therefore they call that, aging of the population. That is happening across the entire world. Except maybe for like India and some Middle Eastern countries, but the rest of the world is experiencing that aging phenomena. And the second thing, the birth rates. The birth rates have been falling and have been falling steadily all over the world. So these kind of two characteristics that are present in a current population, the world population, will trigger a sudden decline or even a plummet after we reach that year 2050, right? So it will start plummeting, and the populations will decrease naturally after the year 2050. Naturally, it means people will be dying more, less people are born, therefore the populations will decline. That's pretty interesting aspect. It always seems like the nature kind of takes care of things itself, and even his projections into this rising temperature and global warming and all that stuff, to be honest with you, doesn't sound too alarming. It seems like the nature has built in, balancing, aspects of it. So I'm not even worried about it. He didn't make me worried about it. He claims also that the entire ecosystem might experience overshoot and collapse, meaning that we'll be using resources, and abusing the planet more than it can handle, which will result in overshoot and collapse. Okay, just to give you a couple examples. Humanity has an ecological footprint, right? So everything we do is burdensome to the planet. All right, just to summarize it. For example, when we release the CO2, carbon dioxide gases, those greenhouse gases, we actually, by their theory, warm up the planet, right? And also, he warns against this growth mindset, pro-growth mindset, what he calls. In other words, we consider doing good on a planetary scale, or we consider success by how much growth we have and how much growth we experience, economy-wise, GDP-wise, etc. And he says we should not have this growth mindset. Instead, what we should have is the sustainability mindset, where we are kind of living within our means and using what the planet can actually handle. Is that governments are very slow to act, because many politicians, when they run for office, all they need obviously is votes, and when they get into the office, what they have to do is deliver on those promises that they had made during the campaign, and their constituents are actually expect them to act fast. So it's not in the interest of a politician to think in terms of 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, because they have to answer to their constituents by fulfilling on their promises, which is a very valid point. I do understand that politicians never think long term, but at the same time, I'm thinking you do have this think tanks, you do have these research institutions, especially in the West, that are thinking long term, that are advising the administrations, etc. Maybe administrations should listen to them more attentively, to these big think tank institutes, such as Brookings Institution, Council on Foreign Relations, others, Rand Corporation, right, just to name a few. They do research. Rockefeller's foundation funds a lot of different research efforts, so to speak. So, I don't see that as a problem. I feel like it's more of a human nature that he's trying to, combat, which is, ridiculous and completely futile, in my opinion. So, what his prescription is to have a forward-looking policy where, politicians and constituents are cognizant of the fact that, they need to have a long-term strategy. And he actually brings China as a big example of that. He says that China, because they don't really care basically what the people think, can have this long-term strategy, because they don't have to kind of fulfill on their political promises right away, right? But at the same time, come to think of it, China does not innovate. It doesn't bring anything new into this world. America does that. California does that. Silicon Valley does that. Not China. It's not really an easy read. It's more of a scientific book. I think it's more written for, people that are, in that field dealing with climate change. I don't see any. I don't like his prescriptions. His prescriptions are always kind of big government. Let's, just kind of forget about the people. Just, have government make all the decisions because it can, and it can make a decisive voice, not as private institutions do. But one thing I picked up from it, and something that, probably you don't even need to read this book. You definitely need to read A Brief History of the Future by Jacques Attali. This one, not so much, unless you are into this kind of subject matters, like I am. But in any case, one thing that you can pick up is that population will peak at, by year 2050, and then it will start plummeting. Another thing is that, another thing that, you can pick up is, he actually talks about areas of the world that will be relatively unscathed or unaffected by the climate change or global warming, and they are pretty much like Midwest of the United States, certain areas of Europe. He actually mentions all that stuff. He says that kind of stay out of the coastlines, kind of be more inland, and he mentions basically northern hemisphere is the place where you want to be by the year 2050. You don't want to be in a climates that are already hot, basically anything below Phoenix, Arizona, and the reason for that, they become even hotter, right? So just basically stay in the northern part of the hemisphere. You can stay either in Europe or the United States. South will kind of still remain poor. I'm talking about the world south, obviously. And north will be relatively unscathed when it comes to climate change. Also, it will be economically more dominant in the world, so that's a good thing. That's where you can find your jobs, where you can find your security, where you can find your prosperity, right, at the end of the day. Another fantastic thing that I picked up from this book is that he mentions and he kind of sheds a light on the fact that in America, people are not worried so much about their well-being. They're more worried about how much money they will make, about their materialistic, about materialism, about their materialistic status than their well-being, right? So he says that in the future, people will be less concerned with materialism and more concerned with their well-being, right? How good they feel inside as opposed to how much money they have in their pocket. I'm not sure it will be true in the United States. I mean, I feel like, this trend of materialism will continue. I mean, it's already true in Europe, where they are more concerned and pay more attention to their well-being than, the money and economics and all that stuff. However, I think Americans, or America in general, will be considering those things. Is that, hey, this is not just about the money and all that stuff. This is not just about money and materialism. It is also about my well-being. It is also about my happiness. Another funny thing he says is that don't teach your children to love the wilderness. He basically says that the wilderness will be becoming more scarce. There'll be less pockets of virgin forests and all these pristine lands, etc. If you don't want your children to feel bad about the disappearance of the wilderness and nature, well, don't expose them to the nature in the first place, right? And therefore they will not feel that they have lost something because they have never experienced it. As the population will continue to grow, and it will, he says that, the curve will continue to go up to the year 2050. The population will continue to grow. And as people become more affluent, and, as we see, for example, in China and India, there is an emergence of a middle class that are buying, goods and services, that are able to travel. There'll be more people in sightseeing across the entire world. Therefore, if you want to see the world and experience it firsthand, go travel now and take a look at all those and take a look at all those wonders of the world, at the places you want to see. Go see them now before they become too crowded, too overcrowded with tourists. But at the same time, don't feel sad if you don't get to travel by the year 2050, because you'll always be able to immerse yourself into these touristy attraction points via virtual reality. You can put that gear on your eyes, maybe put some kind of headphones in, maybe even have some kind of sensory equipment which will be able to deliver you and titillate all of your senses, such as smell, hearing, etc. And it can actually immerse you into these tourist attractions while you're just being at your home. So here is a glimpse of the world and what it will look like by the year 2050. People will be living in mega cities, these huge cities that will have 10 to 40 million people living in them. So think of New York. He also claims that the world will be more polycentric, where the center will be part of the industrialized world and on multiple centers with adequate infrastructure. The periphery will be huge shanty towns basically without infrastructure. There will be cities of gold on a planet of slums. So in a coming world order, there'll be winners and losers. What you need to do is identify who are the winners and basically stay with them, if you so choose. So I strongly, recommend reading these two books: A Brief History of the Future by Jacques Attali. Highly recommend. And this book, I suggest for you to read it if you kind of want to know more about the scientific, perspective on the year 2050 by Jorgen Randers. Thank you so much. Don't forget to put the like and subscribe right below. Thank you.